It was the kind of house most people would look at and think, just another ordinary home. The walls were weathered, a bit worn by time, but nothing truly alarming. The kind of place you could imagine a family settling into, growing old in. A 2-story house, nestled in a quiet neighborhood tucked away just out of sight of the city's hustle and bustle. But every house has its story, doesn't it? There's always something about the place that lingers, something that isn't as simple as it seems. For Emily, it was the basement. She didn't think much of it at first. After all, basements are the forgotten corners of any house, where old boxes are stored, where the pipes groan and the walls crack. A space meant to be neglected. But it was late one evening, around midnight, when she first heard it. A noise so faint, so quiet it barely registered at first. At first, she brushed it off. The house was old, of course, there would be noises. The house had character. But there was something about it. Something in the sound that didn't feel quite right. It was a scratching, faint, soft at first, but unmistakable. The kind of sound you hear when someone, moves through the dust in the shadows. It was coming from downstairs, from the direction of the basement. Emily stood frozen at the top of the stairs, staring down into the blackened void below. She'd never heard anything like it before. And yet, there it was again, scratching, scraping, the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, dragging itself across the floor. At first, she convinced herself it was nothing. Perhaps it was just the old house settling, the floorboards warping under the weight of time. Or maybe the pipes were to blame. An old home, with its creaks and groans, often produces noises that play tricks on the mind. But then there were the whispers, faint and unintelligible, but there, just beneath the scratching. A voice, maybe. It was low, hushed, like someone or something was speaking to her from the depths below. Emily tried to ignore it, turning away from the stairs, the creeping unease growing at the base of her spine. It's just your imagination, she told herself, willing the thoughts away. But deep down, she knew. Something was down there. Night after night, the noises came back. Scratching, dragging, whispers. Each time more urgent, more insistent. As if the thing, whatever it was, had grown aware of her presence, waiting for her. The house felt colder, too. Not just the basement, but the entire house. The air seemed to thicken, a heaviness settling over her, wrapping around her like a cold, uninviting fog. It wasn't just the basement anymore. It was everything. Every corner, every shadow, every creak and groan of the house became a reminder of that dark, unseen presence. One evening, Emily finally decided to confront whatever it was. She had to know what was making the noises, what was hidden in the darkness beneath her feet. She couldn't take the fear any longer. With trembling hands, she grabbed a flashlight, its beam trembling as she held it in front of her. Slowly, she descended into the basement, the wooden steps creaking beneath her weight. Each step felt like a slow descent into madness. The light from the flashlight flickered as she reached the bottom, casting long, distorting shadows across the stone walls. But there was nothing there. She scanned the room, her breath coming faster now, her heart hammering in her chest. The sounds had stopped. The whispers faded. The scratching had ceased. Everything was still. Too still. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she swept the flashlight across the room. Her eyes landed on an old family portrait that hung crookedly on the far wall. A painting of a man and woman dressed in clothes from a time long past. They looked familiar in a way, too familiar. But what caught her attention wasn't just the portrait. It was the figure standing beside the basement door, barely visible in the corner. A figure that wasn't there before. Emily's heart stopped. The figure was blurry, indistinct, like a shadow clinging to the wall. Yet it seemed to be staring at her, its dark eyes burning through the dim light. Before she could react, the ground beneath her feet trembled. An unnatural thud echoed through the basement. She spun around, her flashlight illuminating the floor, but it was nothing. Just old dust, old wood, nothing to explain the noise. And then, there it was again. The scratching. Louder now, closer. So close that Emily could feel it in her bones. It came from behind her, from the darkest corner of the basement. Her pulse quickened as she turned back to the source of the sound. But in that moment, everything went eerily quiet. The scratching stopped. The whispering ceased. Everything stopped. And then, with a sudden crash, something heavy slammed against the wall behind her. The flashlight flickered wildly, illuminating the basement in flashes of stark light before dying completely. The room plunged into darkness. Panic set in. Emily bolted for the stairs, but her legs felt like lead. The sounds of something or someone following her up the steps, dragging behind her, echoed in the darkness. As she reached the top and threw herself into the hallway, she slammed the door shut, panting, heart racing. And the scratching. It never stopped. Some houses seemed to have a life of their own, and for the Turner family, this was one of them. From the outside, it appeared like any other house. 2 stories, with an old porch and a large backyard bordered by overgrown trees. But, as the Turners soon discovered, the house was anything but ordinary. It was the basement that caught their attention. The basement that had been untouched for years. A space that seemed to resist the passage of time itself. The house was cheap, and the family was eager to move in. They needed the space. The kids were growing up, and the cramped apartment they had been living in just wasn't enough anymore. The basement, with its old stone walls and heavy wooden door, was something the family didn't give much thought to at first. But something was off. It wasn't just the creaky floorboards or the peeling wallpaper that seemed out of place. It was the air. There was something heavy about it, a thickness that lingered even in the brightest rooms. Still, the Turners moved in, eager to start fresh, to put their past behind them. That's when the footsteps began. At first, they were faint, a soft, deliberate step in the middle of the night. Not the kind of sound you'd expect to hear in an empty house, but something you could easily dismiss. Old houses creak and groan, after all. But night after night, the steps grew louder, thudding, heavy, like something or someone was pacing in the basement below. Sarah Turner, the matriarch of the family, was the first to hear it. She'd been cleaning late one night, wiping down the counters in the kitchen, when she heard the sound of feet dragging across the floor below. She froze, her rag falling to the floor. The rest of the house was silent, too silent. She called out to her husband, Kevin, but he didn't hear her. He was upstairs with the kids, too far to hear the noise from the basement. The next night, it happened again, and then again. Kevin chalked it up to the house settling. After all, it was an old home, with creaky beams and floorboards. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. It wasn't just the footsteps. It was the way the house seemed to shift in the night, as if it were trying to make room for something or someone else. As days passed, the oddities started to affect everyone. Sarah began to have vivid nightmares about the basement. In these dreams, she was always drawn to the door, unable to resist the pull of whatever lay behind it. But when she opened it, the basement was empty, or so it seemed. There was something about the space, something in the air that felt wrong. She would wake up, drenched in sweat, heart racing, the feeling of being watched lingering long after she was awake. Kevin, too, started having strange dreams. In his, he would walk down the creaking staircase into the basement, only to find the walls closing in around him. He'd hear the dragging steps coming closer, and just as he turned to run, a shadow would flicker at the edge of his vision. It wasn't just the nightmares. It was the hallucinatory glimpses of figures standing just outside the basement door. At first, they thought it was a trick of the light, the shadows playing with their perception. But then, they began to see them even when the lights were on. A silhouette, standing motionless at the foot of the stairs, watching them. And it wasn't just Sarah and Kevin. Their two children, Lily and Ethan, began to act strangely as well. They'd whisper to themselves late at night, speaking of things that no child their age could understand. When asked about it, they'd just shrug, saying they saw someone in the basement, someone who told them not to go near the door. As the days passed, the tension in the house grew unbearable. Arguments erupted over the strangest things. Kevin accused Sarah of overreacting. Sarah accused him of not listening. They were tired, frightened, and on edge. The basement had become the centerpiece of their anxiety, a place they couldn't escape, no matter how hard they tried. It was Sarah who decided enough was enough. She had to know the truth about the basement, why it felt so wrong, why the noises had grown so persistent. She couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. She began to search the house, going through old boxes and papers in the attic. That's when she stumbled upon the journal, a dusty old notebook that had been left behind by the previous owners. As she flipped through its pages, a chilling realization gripped her. The basement had been the site of something far darker than she could have imagined. Years before, a family member of the previous owners had been locked away in that very basement. A relative whose sanity had been slowly eroded by something far worse than isolation. The journal spoke of disturbing rituals, strange practices that took place beneath the house. The last entry sent chills down Sarah's spine. The basement is no longer just a room. It is a prison, and it is alive. The footsteps, the whispers, the constant feeling of being watched. Everything began to make sense. The spirit of the tortured relative had never left. It was trapped, bound to the basement, forever replaying the horrors it had endured. And now, it was calling to the Turner family, pulling them into the same cycle of fear and torment. That night, Sarah gathered Kevin and the kids together, determined to confront whatever was in the basement. They stood at the foot of the stairs, staring down into the dark, knowing that whatever awaited them, they couldn't run from it any longer. As they descended into the basement, the air grew colder, the sound of dragging chains echoing through the space. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, each step louder than the last. And then, in the corner of the room, it appeared. A figure, half hidden in the shadows, its face contorted with pain and anger. It was the spirit of the tortured soul, trapped for eternity in the basement. The family stood frozen, unable to move, as the figure grew more defined, its presence overwhelming. The temperature dropped, and the walls seemed to close in around them. Sarah stepped forward, her heart pounding, and faced the figure. She spoke the words she'd read in the journal, pleading for the spirit to find peace. The basement seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a loud, guttural scream, the spirit vanished into the air, leaving behind only silence. The house, once thick with dread, suddenly felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. But the legacy of the basement, the fear, the torment had left its mark on the Turner family. And though the house seemed peaceful now, Sarah knew they would never truly be free of the basement's grasp. Some legacies are too dark, too powerful, to ever be fully erased. It's easy to overlook the small details when you're in a hurry to move. The creak of an old floorboard, the musty scent of something that's been sealed off for years. We like to think of these things as quirks of age and nothing more. We dismiss them until they begin to pile up, until they make us question whether something is truly as it seems. Take David, for instance, a college student in search of a new place to call home. The apartment he found was cheap, too cheap, in fact, for the neighborhood it sat in. But in the hustle of college life, who could resist the pull of an affordable rent? At first glance, everything appeared fine. The walls were sturdy, the floors creaked in the way old houses do. The kitchen was small, but functional. There was even a cozy little living room that made the place feel homely enough. But there was one thing David couldn't shake, a sense that something wasn't quite right. It was the basement. Old houses always had basements, and David was used to them, dark, cool, slightly damp. But there was something unusual about this one. It was large, too large for the size of the apartment above it. And in the farthest corner, sealed off by a thick brick wall, was a strange sense of finality. Like something or someone had been shut away deliberately. It didn't take long before David's curiosity began to creep in. On his first trip down there, it felt normal at first, cold and musty, just as you'd expect. But there was an odd sensation hanging in the air, as if the basement wasn't quite as empty as it appeared. A feeling that clung to him, that maybe there was something more to this place than simple brick and stone. Night after night he'd hear it, soft sounds at first, faint, distant, scratching, muffled voices, a low thud. David thought nothing of it at first. Houses made noise. It was just the house settling. Perhaps the wind was blowing through the cracks in the walls. But after a few nights, the sounds grew louder, clearer, more insistent. The scratching would follow him. Late into the night, when the world outside was silent and the apartment was cloaked in darkness, David could hear it, coming from behind the sealed brick wall in the corner of the basement. At first, he didn't dare venture near it. But as the days passed, the need to know became overwhelming. The sounds were too real now, too constant. Something was down there, something that was trying to get his attention. He could feel it in his bones, the whispers, the scraping. They never stopped. One evening, fueled by a growing sense of dread and the gnawing need to uncover the truth, David finally decided he would break through. He couldn't go on pretending that the sounds were nothing. It was time to confront whatever was hidden beyond that wall. With nothing more than a crowbar and a flashlight, he stood before the brick barrier, his heart racing as the cool air of the basement enveloped him. His hands shook as he worked the tool into the gaps between the bricks. Dust and debris fell in heavy clouds with each strike, the sound echoing through the basement like the knock of something desperate to be set free. As the final brick fell away, a dark opening emerged, just enough to slip through. David's pulse quickened. He had no idea what he was about to find. Inside, he could barely make out the shape of a small room. The faint light from his flashlight cast long, trembling shadows across the walls. The air inside the room was thick with decay, musty and stale, as if it had been sealed for much longer than the rest of the house. He stepped forward cautiously, his breath shallow, his mind racing with possibilities. Then, the flashlight's beam landed on something. Personal items, old furniture, a torn armchair, a dusty wardrobe. The air felt heavy, like a memory trapped inside the room. Everything was covered in a layer of grime and rot, time having had its way with these forgotten belongings. But what truly caught his attention was a small wooden table, on which lay an old, leather-bound journal. David's heart skipped a beat as he approached it, his hand trembling as he opened the journal. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. The first entry sent a cold shiver down his spine. It is here. It watches me. I can't sleep anymore. Every time I close my eyes, I hear it, feel it in the dark. It won't stop until it gets what it wants. As David read further, the words grew more frantic. The entries described the previous tenant's descent into madness. They spoke of an ancient presence, something that had lived in the basement long before David had even stepped foot in the apartment. Something that had been waiting for someone to come along. Something that wanted to be found. With every page, David's heart pounded harder. The stories of strange occurrences, of noises that grew louder as the nights wore on, mirrored his own experiences. The final entry was the most chilling of all. It's waiting for you now, just behind the wall. I couldn't escape. I don't know how much longer I have. At that moment, the basement seemed to grow colder. David's breath came in shallow bursts, and his flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. And then, as if it was answering his fear, something moved in the darkness. Out of the corner of his eye, David saw a figure, a shadow, half hidden, standing motionless near the far wall. His pulse surged, and for a moment he could hardly breathe. A figure watching him, waiting. It was just a shadow, but it felt so real, so present. David's hand tightened around the flashlight. He could feel something in the room, something watching him, something that had been hidden for far too long. The journal hadn't been lying. The tenant's words were no longer just a warning, they were a prophecy. And as he backed toward the door, the scratching began again. Louder, closer, no longer coming from behind the wall. Now, it was coming from right behind him. If you want more terrifying true horror stories like these, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Stay tuned for more chilling tales, but remember, some things are better left alone, because once you open that door, you might never be able to close it again. We'll see you in the next video, but remember, some basements are best left undisturbed.